By July 1940, if you looked at a map of Europe, the reality was grim. Shadows were creeping across the map, representing the sheer scale of Adolf Hitler's dictatorial control. From Poland to France, Norway to Belgium, nearly the entire continent had fallen under German occupation. The old alliances had crumbled. Mussolini's Italy had joined forces with Germany in the south, and a peace agreement kept the Soviet Union out of the fight in the east. That left exactly one major European power standing against the German war machine. Britain was entirely alone. Looking at his overwhelming military advantage, Hitler assumed the fight was effectively over. He believed the British leadership, facing total destruction, would succumb to fear and sign a peace treaty. In his mind, the war was already won. But that assumption was his first major miscalculation. His absolute certainty in his own power blinded him to the actual resolve of the enemy across the Channel. Instead of signing a treaty, Winston Churchill gave a speech that made his position absolute. He told his country they would fight on the beaches, fields, and streets. We shall never surrender. There would be no negotiation. Since Britain is an island and the Royal Navy heavily outnumbered German ships, a direct land or sea invasion was impossible. Hitler had to pivot. He drafted Operation Sea Lion, a strategy that relied entirely on establishing total control of the sky. This chart shows the staggering imbalance in the air. The German Luftwaffe brought 2,600 aircraft to the fight. The British Royal Air Force had only 700. In July 1940, Hitler unleashed those forces on British airfields and factories. The attacks soon escalated into relentless night bombings over London. The sky filled with bombers, setting parts of the city ablaze and killing massive numbers of civilians in an attempt to break their spirit. Yet the British held on. The difference came down to motivation. An invading army fights for conquest, but a defending nation fights for its very existence. If the British pilots failed, their homes, their families, and their country would be wiped off the map. Fighting with everything they had, those outnumbered pilots repelled the overwhelming German forces. The Battle of Britain Day marked Hitler's first real defeat. It proved a massive, overpowered military could be stopped by extreme human motivation. Realizing the skies over Britain wouldn't easily fall, Hitler abandoned his plans for the UK invasion and turned his attention eastward. He already had a peace treaty with the Soviet Union, but military logic was taking a back seat to his ideology. Driven by a deep hatred of communists and a megalomaniacal delusion that he was meant to rule the world, he decided to break the pact. This map shows the massive three-pronged blitzkrieg invasion launched in June 1941, striking Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine. The Soviets had far more tanks, 20,000 to Germany's 6,000, but superior German technology overwhelmed the defenders quickly. They pushed hundreds of kilometers, stopping just short of Moscow. By letting his ideological obsession override sound strategy, Hitler trapped his own forces. He was now fighting a brutal, geographically immense two-front war. Then the weather turned. The brutal Russian winter officially set in, completely freezing the German advance in its tracks. The cold heavily favored the Soviet troops, who were fully adapted to fighting and surviving in sub-zero temperatures. This climatic advantage led to the Battle of Stalingrad. It devolved into a gruesome, existential struggle, block by ruined block, becoming the deadliest conflict of the entire war. The Soviets refused to yield. Eventually, they surrounded nearly 300,000 German soldiers inside the city limits, forcing a massive, humiliating surrender in early 1943. While the German army bled out in the snow, their ally made a fatal error in the Pacific. Japan launched a sudden, unprovoked attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Up until that morning, the United States had stayed firmly out of the global conflict. That single misstep dragged a heavily industrialized, neutral nation directly into the fight on the side of the Allies. Between Hitler's arrogance in invading the Soviet Union and Japan's recklessness in the Pacific, the Axis powers had accidentally forged an unstoppable global alliance against themselves. Their fate was sealed. On June 6, 1944, the vice began to close. D-Day brought over 150,000 British, American, and Canadian soldiers onto the beaches of Normandy, tearing open a massive new Western front. With German troops suddenly pulled westward to defend France, the Soviets launched a massive counterattack of their own, rapidly, violently clawing back hundreds of kilometers of territory in the east. At the same time, the Southern Front collapsed from within. The anti-fascist Italian masses, fed up with the devastation, rose up, overthrew their government, and executed the dictator Mussolini. From the west, the east, and the south, the borders of the Axis Empire were collapsing inward. Hitler's forces were completely encircled, being crushed simultaneously from all directions. The final months of the war were agonizing. Allied forces conducted devastating aerial bombings on German cities, and the daily death toll across Europe climbed to staggering numbers. By May of 1945, Berlin was entirely surrounded by the Soviet army. Facing capture, Hitler took his own life in a bunker, and Germany formally surrendered days later. The aftermath redrew the map of Europe. Germany was divided, and national borders were reconstructed. Decades of peace efforts followed, eventually leading to the creation of the European Union, an organization designed to tie nations together through trade, rather than tear them apart through war. Globally, the modern United Nations was established by the victorious Allied countries, creating a framework to ensure a conflict of this sheer scale could never happen again. The ruins of World War II leave us with a clear truth. Extreme hubris and the pursuit of absolute power do not build lasting empires. They only architect their own total destruction.